is Oromo Voice Radio English program. Oromo Voice Radio is broadcasting to Oromia at 16-meter band or 17,850 kilohertz or on oromovoice.org website. OVR broadcasts Oromia Insight program every Monday for 15 minutes at 7:15 p.m. Oromia local time. Welcome to Oromia Insight program.
Oromia is a country in East Africa well known as the Horn of Africa. It's 600,000 square kilometers, making it larger than France, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Oromia is populated by over 40 million people. It's the origin of human race and the Gada system. Oromia is the birthplace of coffee and home to world-class athletes. Also is a nation with multi-faith society, Christianity, Islam, and Waqf. Oromia is the third largest single nation in Africa and the single largest nation in East Africa. It has been occupied by Ethiopia for over 130 years and is struggling for self-determination. Oromia has unaccounted number of Oromo refugees living in other countries.
Welcome to Oromia Insight. My name is Aliye Geleto. I have a guest from University of Melbourne, Tsegaye Ararssa. Welcome, Tsegaye.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you for having me.
Today we're going to talk about state formation, the method used to sustain itself. We're talking about Ethiopia. When was the Ethiopia we know came to existence and how?
That's a great question, Ali. The Ethiopia we know, the territory we call Ethiopia today, came into existence between the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Now, its Abyssinian core of the North Central Highlands had its own state system for a long time, allegedly for over 3,000 years. But that core incorporated the larger territory that is now part of Ethiopia only in the 20th century. And the name Ethiopia is also formally used only after that, after the formation of the modern Ethiopian state. And in fact, the word Ethiopia became the formal name of the state in that area only after the Second World War. Up until then, it was the Abyssinian Empire. The method that was used to establish this state that now has come to be Ethiopia is conquest and military expansion. And of course, speaking in terms of the ideational structure, the ideological and legal structure based on which the country was formed, if we have to talk in those terms, the country was established by two collaborative developments. One is colonial international law of the 19th century, the late 19th century, and the domestic imperial constitutional law of the 20th century. So these are two things that were deployed after the military conquest, the military expansion and subjugation of large number of people, especially in the southern and eastern and western territories of Ethiopia. The ideology used was basically colonial international law and domestic imperial constitutional law. Now, colonial international law came into the picture because it was a time of scramble for Africa since the late 1880s, and the Ethiopian Empire, the Abyssinian Empire, at the time was very much observant of that fact, and there were a number of colonial forces like the British in the Sudan, in Kenya, and Hargeisa, British Somaliland, and then there were the Italians in Italian Somaliland, and they were having some attempts to control the Eritrea and the Red Sea area in the north. And then there were the French in what is then known as French Somaliland or Tajura, which is now Djibouti. So these colonial empires from Europe, which were using colonial international law, particularly based on the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 to scramble for Africa. They were trying to negotiate their way into their own sphere of influence with the Abyssinian emperors. So from 1880 up until 1900, the Ethiopian territory that we know as Ethiopia today was more or less carved out and delimited through the help of international treaties with these forces, the British, the Italians, and the French. So the country was formed, the state was formed first from outside before it was formed from inside. Internally, it was a massive military expansion and subjugation of the southern peoples of Ethiopia that was happening, but there was no formal establishment, legal establishment of the state form. So first, the international formed the country's territory and gave recognition to the sovereign existence of the emperors of Ethiopia and the empire of Ethiopia. And then, having especially won the Battle of Adwa in 1896, and having had all the treaties between 1902 and 1909, the emperors started to build the nation and the state. The nation building, the state building process was based on two things. One, modernization, which means establishment of modern bureaucracy, modern military, and so on. And two, forced or involuntary assimilation of the large number of people that were incorporated into the territory into the Amhara Tigray Abyssinian culture, which means through conversion into Christianity, through forcing Amharic as the language of the people, and forcing out the local languages, through imposition of other, the Abyssinian culture, and so on and so forth. While that was going on, they also realized that they have to modernize the legal system in the European way. So by 1931, they came to have the first written constitution, which formally re-established the state of the Ethiopian empire and consolidated the powers of the emperor. So from the very beginning, the state form that we have in operation in Ethiopia today was conceived in violence, through the violence of colonial international law and through the violence of domestic imperial constitutional law, which is undergirded and preceded by a serious atrocious military expansion and subjugation.
I'm just curious, Oromos, Ugaden, Benshangul, others nationality, they weren't actually part of the Ethiopia until 1945.
The Ogadenis, the Somalis, were not part of the old Abyssinian empire for a long time. Actually, they have never been part of it until after the British have helped liberate Ethiopia from the Italian fascists in 1941. Because the Somali have been really the outliers. Someone calls them the people who have suffered triple oppression in Ethiopia after the incorporation, meaning the class, religious, and ethnic operation. So the Ogadeni have always been the outliers. They were incorporated. Their incorporation became complete in 1940. After the 1940s, their conquest happened between 1889 and 1900. It wasn't really governed by the Ethiopian emperors even until the end of the war. So that's why the Somali have never identified themselves with Ethiopia, and that's why we still have their ambition to liberate themselves from Ethiopia through the OMLF. But the Somali issue was also complicated by the irredentist movement that existed in Ethiopia, in the Somali region, because in the 1960s, after the independence of Somalia from the British and the Italians, they had this greater Somalia project, into which they wanted to pull all the Somalis in Kenya, in Ethiopia, the Somalis in Djibouti also. And so that's why the Somali is always the outlier, and they have never been part of Ethiopia. They have never considered themselves as Ethiopians.
So the Ethiopians,
the other people, yeah.
So the Ethiopians are the Tigrayans and the Amhara then until 1945.
The Ethiopians are probably slightly more than the Tigrayans and the Amharas, but the state is fundamentally, at its core, dominated by the Amhara and the Tigrayans. They changing hands over the power every now and then. The case of the Oromo is slightly complicated because the Oromo has been part of the northern empire since the beginning of the 17th century. They have been very much dominant in Gondar, the Yejju Oromo, that's a particular kind of particular group of Oromo. The Yejju Oromo in Wollo have been very much dominant in the Gondar palace between 1786 and 1855 in particular, the time that is known in Ethiopian history as the era of princes. So there is a bit of the Oromo involvement in the empire in the 17th, 18th century, but the large majority of the Oromo people have never been part of that Abyssinian core. Even the Oromos that were jockeying for power in Gondar during the era of princes were not were assimilated. Actually, they were operating in the language and culture and in the ideology of the Abyssinian core. So the Oromo weren't part of it. The other peoples of Ethiopia, the large majority of the southern people, they have been raided and incorporated in the 19th century. And of course, over the years during medieval times, there were similar imperial expansionist activities run by people like emperors like Amdetyon Zerayakov, who had for a while conquered those places. And in the 19th century, when the new modernizing emperors came into power, what they were saying they are doing was that it was a reunification process, reclaiming the land that they have lost during the medieval time. Other than that, the large majority of despot peoples that are now incorporated in the 19th century, late 19th century, have never been part of the Abyssinian empire. They have never been part of the Abyssinian core.
Can the Oromo First movement, yes. As you can actually going through the history of Ethiopia, just the Oromo First come to my mind. So the Oromos is also incorporated to current Ethiopian system by force. That's why Oromos, they don't want to claim Ethiopia. Can you explain the relationship between Oromo and the current Ethiopian states?
Yes, the Oromo were conquered and subjugated to be part of the Ethiopian state in the 19th century, between 1882 and 1900. Of course, the Shoa Oromo has been under a series of conquest and attack by the Abyssinians beginning from the 1840s, but the incorporation in full happened between 1882 and 1882 and 1900. From that time on, what changed? For many years, the Oromo had resisted the expansionist policies, but what changed at that time was the European rifles arrived. The Abyssinian emperors began to have the European rifle, modern artillery, and that changed the rules. That changed the game. Using colonial international laws I mentioned earlier, and using internationally made, more technologized means of warfare, they conquered the Oromo territory. Having conquered it, they realized that the Oromo is large in number demographically and vast in size, in territory, geographically, and they thought that unless they assimilate the Oromo into the Amhara core, which means unless they make the Oromos forget their Oromo identity, they cannot continue to rule over them. So what they did was they developed a policy for the assimilation of the Oromo. In fact, in the early 20th century, around 1930s, a man that later came to be a Minister of Education came up with a policy. He studied this in the Colonial University of Antwerp in Belgium. His name is Tedla Haile, and he wrote a thesis which says the why and how of assimilation of the Oromo. And one of the things he suggested to the emperors of the time was that because the Oromo and the Amhara are equal in number, which was an exaggeration because they were not equal, the Oromo was more in number. Because they are equal in number, unless we assimilate the Oromo to the Amhara, this nation, he says, is going to be two nations. So there is no way we can build one nation out of all this unless we assimilate the Oromo quickly. So he suggested a plan of assimilation. In fact, he considered a number of other options, like extermination. And he said, no, this is impossible. Assimilation is the only way to rule the Oromos. So one of the things that he suggested was to resettle as many northerners as they can in the Oromo territory, to marry the Oromos, the Oromo women, as much as possible, and to not to educate them in Amharic language, in Ge'ez language actually, he suggested. And he also said that education of the Oromos should be limited to a very elementary level, only for the sake of inculcating their Ethiopian identity and so on and so forth. And of course to also impart the Abyssinian religion, which is Orthodox Christianity.
This interview will continue next week.